Hello, everyone. Welcome back. This is The Last Defense. I'm your host today, DC. I wanted to cover a brief topic for today, speaking a little bit more about the war in Iran. Or I should say the war against Iran. What we'll look at here are some of the new developments that took place yesterday on Thursday. I'm recording this as Friday, and we'll just have a quick look to see what's taking place in Jordan, another one of the battlefronts that's erupted over the past few hours. So if we'll go ahead, I'll go ahead and share this with you. Take a quick look at this, and here we go. So there have been multiple news reports coming out. This one is from the Tasman news agency. This is Iran affiliated, and we've had some announcements that several U.S. troops have been killed and F-35 jets were destroyed in an IRGC strike on American base in Jordan. So this base is specifically this is the Azraq Air Base in Jordan. And what they did is they retaliated against a recent airstrike that the United States conducted on Kashim Island. And what happened there is a family of 3 people were killed, and there were 2 casualties of 2 children under the age of 10. So in retaliation, the IRGC Airspace Force, they destroyed 3 American F-35 fighter jets, and they killed U.S. military personnel in this specific retaliatory strike. What happened also is that the IRGC also released a statement, and they state here specifically, they said they addressed the honorable and discerning people of Jordan, saying that their sincere accompaniment and cooperation, particularly the explicit positions adopted by groups of Jordanian elites, had tightened the noose around the enemy and left it desperate. So they're speaking about the complicity that the Jordanian government has had in hosting these military bases, and additionally endangering the security of the region based on the current ongoing war. So they also stated that in the early hours of Thursday, the helpless American enemy, instead of engaging in a fair military confrontation, used occupied bases in Jordan to launch bunker buster bombs against 2 residential houses on Iran's Kashim Island. So that strike that they're retaliating against happened in early Thursday. So as a countermeasure, what they did is they bombed the military base in Jordan. So they said that in response to this crime and to help you liberate the Islamic land of Jordan from the calamity of the American occupiers, the RIGC Airspace Force targeted the parking ramp and maintenance hangar used by American F-35 fighter jets at the Al Azraq Air Base with several ballistic missiles. And they said that they completely destroyed 3 F-35 fighter aircraft and inflicted heavy damage on 3 others. And they state here, one of the most kind of salient things about this statement is that they said the struggle of us and you will continue until the last American occupier is expelled from the Islamic lands. So in this statement, not only are they addressing the United States and other allies, but they're specifically speaking to the Jordanian people, or the Jordanian state rather, for hosting these military bases and then launching attacks from there on Kashim Islands. That Iran is actually going to go after each one of these installations to try to free up the Islamic, the Middle East, from a lot of these occupying forces that they have stated. So what this tells us about is that this tells us that not only has Iran continued to demonstrate that it has the capability to strike and retaliate against any American kind of strikes and any responses from allied nations, what it also tells us is that it's become quite a bit of a difficult situation in the Middle East for those housing any kind of military assets based upon the location of these U.S. military bases. So this is going to give us 2 different things that we can actually speak about. The first thing is the economic impact of these F-35s. And what we see here is that, according to this basically PR, the F-35s are manufactured by Lockheed Martin. This is a US military defense contractor, and oftentimes what they have developed, they have different kinds of fighter jets, they have different kinds of missile defense systems, radar, and so on, within their portfolio. But what we need to understand about each and every F-35, F2, Lightning II, that is deployed across the Middle East, every loss of that asset significantly, eats away at the budget of the US military defense budget. And so they're supposed to be state-of-the-art types of weapons. They're supposed to be loaded with AI. They're creating jobs in AI, cybersecurity, software development, and so on and so on. But aside from all the fluff, we need to look at the most important thing. So the F-35 is America's largest and important defense program. And so what they've actually got is a global supply chain of over 2,100 suppliers for more than a dozen countries. And secondly, for each of the different types of F-35s that they produce 3 types. And this is, firstly, the average flyaway cost. This means from the beginning of production to the end, within the supply chain and within the manufacturing, hierarchy, the cost of an F-35A is $82.5 million. So that's the base model. It's $109 million for an F-35B and $102.1 million for an F-35C, the top spec model. And so what they say here also is the F-35 team is working across government and industry for greater affordability. So these things are expensive. They acknowledge that with this statement. And the Lockheed Martin has significantly lowered its share of cost per flight over the last 5 years. So these are basically expensive boondoggle assets that are being scattered across the military bases within the Middle East region and elsewhere. And the United States has kind of worked with a lot of sovereign governments around the world to try to sell these F-35s to them. I remember back in 2017, I know that they wanted multiple allies to buy F-35 Lightning IIs. And one of the things it does is 2 things to a foreign military or a foreign occupied, inoccupied foreign power. What it does, number one, is it significantly increased the cost of defense. So unless you want a military base on there, if you start selling these F-35s to a lot of the different countries around in the area, that's $100 million per plane just to buy them. And it's not including any kind of upkeep or any kind of maintenance or the cost of munitions or anything that you would need, say, for example, software patches. And, I remember reporting a while back on it, and I think that the F-35 had hundreds of major errors within its, its operating system, not software, but the entire system itself, the entire ecosystem of the fighter jet. And so those are still ongoing, and those are still being patched up and corrected with each release of the model. So imagine you go on the first deliveries of that and you realize that your pilot runs out of air because they haven't got enough air to the power, to the breathing supply. There's things that don't fire. There's lots of issues. So these F-35s are what they would refer to in the United States as boondoggles. They're expensive white elephant programs in, the US military, military industrial complex. We could even say that. Now, that said, we go into something here, which is very, very important for us to note. So this is an article by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and it talks about the status of key munitions at the Iran war ceasefire. So this is during the ceasefire in April that was, pretty much brokered I think it was under Pakistan, who was the mediator for this entire thing. But the report is from Mark Kansian and Chris Park. And this is, keep in mind, back in April. This is not the current state where things have ratcheted up. And we'll get into that very, very soon. So in April, at the time, we had the status of key munitions, which we have multiple different kinds here. We have Tomahawk missiles, which cost 2.6 million per missile. And then you have PRSMs. So these are like precision, missile strikes. And these are 1.6 million. You have SM3s, SM6s at 28.7 million and 5.3 million, respectively. And then these are the thermal high altitude aerial defense, if I got that correctly. So these are the THAAD missiles. These are the ones that are supposed to intercept a lot of the heavier bombardment and different types of weaponry that go out of the Earth's atmosphere and then come back down to strike the targets. Those oftentimes can be MIRVs. Those are multi-entry kind of multi-entry vehicle missiles. So they'll have one missile splits off into multiple heads, and those multiple heads will then strike different targets. Those are very, very deadly, hostile kinds of weapons. Stuff that you would see with the Oreshnims and things like that, and that are based, or the Oreshnik ones that are based in Russia, if I'm not mistaken. So then you have the Patriot missiles, which are 3.9 million. So these were the inventories in April, estimated pre-war inventory. So this is the estimate that they gave for this these particular weapons, and then this is the estimated use in the Iran war. So they estimated they were going to use 1,000 Tomahawk missiles. They estimated they were going to use 40 to 70 PRSMs. They were going to use 190 to 290 THAADs, and Patriot missiles. They were going to use 1,060 to 1,430. The key thing that we want to note here is this: the delivery times. For one Tomahawk missile, it takes 47 months from the beginning of production to the deployment to an actual base or, the finished product. And so we notice that 47 to 48 months for these first three types of weapons. That is 4 years for them to manufacture any new weapons. For the SM3s, which are the most expensive ones, it's 64 months. That's just over 5 years. It's a lot of time to deployment. In addition to THAADs, which they're pretty much run out of, it's 53 months for the THAADs and the SM6s. Patriot missiles are 42, so that's the easiest, time to production, within the project life cycle. So this is very bad for the United States, because if they run low on munitions, they've had to deploy munitions from the Asia-Pacific theater. They've rerouted those to the Middle East to actually use within the war against Iran. And then on top of that, they've had to stop selling to Ukraine, which is now the reason why Ukraine has resorted to drone usage, because it's easier cost of production and they have their own facilities within Kiev and, Ukraine to deploy those. And those are the ones that are now getting targeted by the Russian Federation. So when we look at this, because they don't have the missiles to deliver to allies, they've had to resort to focus all of them on Iran. And the problem with that is that they're using all of their expensive weaponry that is supposedly the backbone of their air defense, their air offensive capability, to strike these targets, which are having limited effects and are being retaliated against with very, very cheap and efficient weapons on the side of Iran. So we can, this is one of the reasons why US CENTCOM, they decided, the Central Military Command, they decided that they were going to pause strikes, and they're now trying to draw up a new plan. And what's happening right now is they're so low on munitions because they know it's going to be, they thought they were going to have this war finished within a few days. They were just going to decapitate the leadership, you know, in whatever, you know, kind of delusional mind that they were going to have about that. And that it would just be all over, the same way that Venezuela was over. They put in a tactical strike on Venezuela, you know, special forces went in there, grabbed Maduro, and that was it. But what we're noticing now is that we're seeing that not only did that not happen, but we're in our fifth year. I mean, we're in our fifth month of war, and they didn't plan for that. They didn't have the capability to withstand a long war. And I would dare say that the United States is doing its best to save face at this point, because they know that the next time that they're going to have missiles, enough missiles to carry out the same kind of operation, is going to be within 4 to 5 years. And they don't have that time because the Strait of Hormuz is closed. Bab el-Mandeb Strait is closed as well. And there's talks that the Suez Canal could also close as well. But those are the three major throughputs for international trade in the Middle East. So that means the Bab el-Mandeb Strait is closed. So Saudi Arabia does not get all the supplies it needs because the Houthis have now commanded that area. Strait of Hormuz is still closed, and any vehicles going through there are actually going to not be able to pass. The only thing that the United States can do right now is to initiate a blockade far off of the coast of the last point of the Strait of Hormuz, the opening to it. So they want to be outside of striking range. And so we'll look at that specifically. Now, this is going to be critical for us to look at when it comes to the defensive capabilities of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Firstly, we need to see here that the United States basically, over the last few decades, ever since it struck up its deal with the Saudi Arabians, the Saudis, to launch the petrodollar, we're going to mandate it so that everyone trades in dollars for any kind of Brent crude or any kind of oil products in exchange for military defensive capabilities, first strike capabilities, and military bases to offset the cost to the different occupied governments within the Middle East region. So what they did, and this is before the US really assessed any of Iran's capabilities to actually strike. So Iran's here, and the headquarters for CENTCOM is in Qatar. That is less than a Ryanair flight all the way from Tehran to Qatar. And dare I say that they didn't really think that through. And of course, the author will actually, illuminate that a bit more as we read this article. But I just wanted to give you the visual context for this to kind of see exactly how this affects the current ongoing US-Iran war. So we have Bahrain is here, Qatar is here, UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabian military bases are here. Jordan, Israel is slightly out of striking range for the Shahed 131s, but not out of striking range for the Shahed 136s. So these are the missiles and the different kinds of drones that Iran can use to reach these different targets. Even Turkey is not without, any kind of retaliatory strikes. And so we have quite a few deadly issues here, even in Greece. Greece and Crete are still within targeting range. And one of the largest military installations here is in Djibouti for the United States. So that's pretty bad. It's very bad, and actually it doesn't take long for them to deploy these missiles. Now, as each of these different ones, these military installations, are basically what they call all but uninhabitable, which means that essentially what the Iranian government has done is when the IRGC strikes each of these military installations, it has rendered them inhospitable, meaning that out of the 20 that are currently in operation across the Middle East, only 4 are fully functional. which is why, because of this striking range for the cheaper Shahed 131 range, the United States decided to move its assets to Ben Gurion Airport. These are the refueling tankers because, number one, there's no fuel. Iran has destroyed many of the, the infrastructure needed to refuel the tankers. In each of the military bases, there's usually like a fuel depot, a refinery of some kind. Those have been destroyed in all but 3 or 4 different military bases. On top of that, civilian infrastructure has been destroyed because those refineries have been hit all across the Strait of Hormuz, and additionally in Saudi Arabia most recently, and I think it was parts of Jibril, if I'm not mistaken, that's the title for it, the city or the region area. Those have been struck. Those are some of Saudi Aramco's largest assets, if not the largest refineries in the country. And that has caused immense chaos because of the fighting between Saudi Arabia and Yemen. So the Houthis, I believe, they've hit those refineries, which has caused a bit of chaos. Let's go to the most important bit. So this article is basically talking about why the U.S. should rethink its Middle East basing strategy. This is an article by Elliot Abrams, and this is actually not in the newspapers, but in the Council on Foreign Relations. And it's very critical that we think about this because this is the newspaper for the, for the elites, the people actually within U.S. policy, within global think tanks, and so on. So this was written up July 21st, so that's roughly 10 days ago. So Elliot Abrams is actually no small potato, if you want to look at it that way. He served as a deputy assistant to the president and deputy national security advisor in the George W. Bush administration, where he supervised U.S. policy in the Middle East. He later served as special representative for Iran and Venezuela in the first Donald Trump administration. So that's pretty high up there. And what we notice is that what he's telling us is that because of the conglomeration of military bases within the proximity of Iran's striking capability, the US, instead of emboldening its allies, it has actually made the region more dangerous to operate in. So you're losing billions of assets. So he actually says this here. He says the conflict between the United States and Iran has illuminated a factor in US policy that has received too little attention until this year. The US basing pattern in the Middle East. US bases in the region are now the targets of Iranian attacks, accounting for the vast majority of the 17 reported, that's the keyword, reported US service member deaths, the injuries to roughly 500 others, and the billions of dollars in equipment losses. This is a geography problem, and he's 100% right in this. So he says even further, simply put, the United States has bases all over the Persian Gulf that are too close to Iran. The largest U.S. base in the Middle East is the Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar, where roughly 10,000 U.S. troops worked prior to the current war. It is also the forward headquarters of the U.S. Central Command and the location of the Combined Air Operations Center that controls all U.S. activity in the entire Middle East. So these 3 critical junctions are within striking range of Shahed 131s, the lower range missile and drone capabilities for Iran. He also says there are significant U.S. bases as well in Kuwait. Oh, sorry, I missed one part. It's important. The headquarters of the U.S. Fifth Fleet and the U.S. Royal Forces Central Command are in Bahrain. There are significant U.S. bases as well in Kuwait and the United Arab Emirates and the U.S. presidents in Oman and Saudi Arabia. All are within easy striking distance of Iran. So we'll go back to this and you can see the visual as to how this relates. So the ones in red are U.S. military sites. The one in green are Israeli sites, which the U.S. aircraft have relocated to. So all of the aircraft have relocated to these two bases in Israel. One is in Tel Aviv, and I forget where the other one is, but we'll leave that to another day. So it said that the basing pattern was logical when the United States was fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq, because they were dealing with enemies that didn't have a really strong, air defense system. They were fighting against people like the Taliban. They were fighting against Saddam Hussein's military back in the two Gulf Wars, which were not strong militaries. The Taliban, on the other hand, was mostly a ground force. And so those US bases were actually quite useful. However, they didn't have the same capabilities and, military powers as Iran. They said here, the basing power here is very vulnerable today in the conflict with Iran. Given the range of missiles and drones in Iran's arsenal, US bases further away would still be in danger, but there would be more time for personnel to get to safety. This is key. The reason why, he says, there would be more time for personnel to get to safety because of the proximity of these US military bases. It does not take long for Iran to strike these areas. And it's so much to the point that, in my personal opinion, these 17 dead personnel is a very, very low estimate of how many people have actually died serving on these military installations. And so I would put them in estimates of over 200 or more, because when they have this ability to strike so quickly, these installations have little to no time to prepare, and that can leave a lot of people vulnerable. That's not even including the ones that can actually penetrate a lot of the defenses. As you notice now, these installations are not being hit the same way that they were hit back in June of last year. So when Iran launched retaliatory strikes against the United States after the first incursion, many of those were shot down with interceptors. Now that's not taking place at all. So this is what we were talking about earlier with the key munitions. Those key munitions have run out completely, and they will need to take upwards between 3 to 7 years for them to get that going. And with the Strait of Hormuz closed, it's going to be more difficult for them to manufacture that, because they don't have the supplies needed to leave the Strait of Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb Strait, to reach those facilities again. They would have to get airspace to actually give them permission through Saudi Arabia or through Israel, into Saudi Arabia, into those installations, to where they could actually deploy those missile defense systems, radars that have been destroyed, and so on and so on. Just to kind of wrap things up here, he says here, dozens of US aircraft have relocated, excuse me, to Ben Gurion Airport and Ramon Air Base. So the other one is Ramon Air Base in Israel. The United States is also using bases in Jordan, where the US forces sustained casualties and 2 deaths last week. So the most recent one is a continuation of that destruction. Retired General Frank McKenzie, a former CENTCOM commander, believes moves, more moves away from Iran in the Gulf are needed. So here's what, General Frank McKenzie says. He says, no one in their right mind would ever put the CENTCOM forward headquarters, 100 miles away from Iran in Qatar. Yet that's where it is. Now he's speaking to the Middle Eastern Eye in this in early July. He says, he currently described the United States' current basing pattern as a historic artifact, meaning it's completely outdated. And he said US basing strategy does not match the reality on the ground. He also concluded that we need to look west. We need to look at basing in Israel, both due to its distance from Iran and because, in his view, it would impose the least restrictions on US access, basing, and overflight rights. So they would have direct access from, I believe that's the Red Sea. Let's go back into here. Yeah, so we would have basically, you'd have access to the Mediterranean, you'd have the Aegean Sea, you'd have other parts that you could go to right around Cyprus into Israel, and that would allow them to have their military installations there. Putting them anywhere near, the Gulf of Aden, right here, or, the Strait of Hormuz up here, even, dare I say, the Caspian Sea up here, that's a disaster. So, looking at all of this, this is this military basing strategy was created at a time in which the US believed its hegemony to be a strong military asset in the Middle Eastern region. And in 5 months, that has been proven completely false. And here's the problem. And this is just me speaking off the cuff a little bit. In times of war and in times of conflict, whether that is through physical military and engagement with an enemy or an information, when you have rhetoric that is being espoused, and then you also have facts as they happen on the ground. There was the old thing, the first casualty of war is the truth. And I'll just loosely paraphrase that comment. It's true, because when these different, the United States claims to be the largest power on the planet with the biggest military presence anywhere. And in 5 months, there's little to no military presence in the Middle East. That was where some of the largest installations were put. And so it's important for us to realize that rhetoric and physical material action are completely divorced from one another. Oftentimes they'll use their words to cover up things, and they'll use, omission of truth to actually cover up what's taking place. So there are only now 4 military bases, 4 military installations that are partially functional in the Middle East, thanks to this war in Iran, war against Iran. And furthermore, a country that has been under sanctions for decades, since 1979, was able to destroy the world's largest, military superpower. But in terms of assets, it's not really in terms of engagement. So this is just something to think about. I'm going to leave it here because we've gone a little bit over time, but I do appreciate your time and attention to this. Thank you for joining. This has been the Last Defense DC speaking to you. And hope this has been useful to you. Hope this is helpful to kind of understand what's going on in the current state of affairs. And until next time, speak your mind, defend the truth, and keep your sanity. Bye now.